England, today recognized as the largest and most influential part of the United Kingdom, did not begin as a powerful nation but instead as a land shaped by thousands of years of movement, isolation, and cultural fusion. Long before it became an island, Britain was connected to mainland Europe by a vast stretch of low-lying land known as Doggerland, which gradually vanished as the Ice Age melted around 11,000 years ago. Early settlers brought farming techniques from the Middle East, giving rise to permanent communities and the first ceremonial structures, including the mysterious stone circles that still stand today. Over centuries, new groups arrived from across Europe, blending languages and customs until Celtic culture became dominant. This world changed dramatically in 55 BC when Julius Caesar first attempted to invade, though a full Roman conquest would only come in AD 43 under Emperor Claudius. The Romans reshaped England completely, building towns like Londinium, roads, forts, and the famous Hadrian's Wall to secure their northern border. Despite uprisings such as Boudicca's fierce rebellion, Roman rule endured for nearly 4 centuries before collapsing under the pressure of invading tribes and internal decline. When Roman armies withdrew, new settlers from northern Europe, the Anglo-Saxons, slowly filled the vacuum, bringing with them their own beliefs, languages, and social structures. Romano-British traditions faded, replaced by small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms such as Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and Kent, each competing for influence. By the 7th century, these kingdoms formed the backbone of an emerging English identity, though unity was still far from reality. England's earliest history is not the story of one people, but of countless groups arriving, settling, and reshaping the land, creating a culture built on adaptation, exchange, and constant transformation. By the time Anglo-Saxon society had begun to settle into a pattern of small competing kingdoms, England faced a new and far more dangerous threat from across the sea. In the late 8th century, longboats began appearing on the coastlines, carrying warriors whose ferocity would soon become legendary, the Vikings. Though there had been minor raids before, the attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 marked the beginning of a new age of fear and uncertainty. For decades, Viking raids targeted wealthy monasteries and isolated settlements, but by 865 their ambitions changed dramatically. A massive force, later remembered as the Great Heathen Army, landed in England with the intention not just to plunder but to conquer. One after another, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell. Northumbria was taken in 867, East Anglia in 869, and Mercia was broken by 874, leaving only Wessex standing against the invaders. Wessex's young king, Alfred, faced overwhelming odds as Viking forces pushed deeper into his territory, even driving him into hiding in 878. Yet Alfred refused to accept defeat. Gathering what remained of his people, he launched a final counterattack at the Battle of Edington, winning a decisive victory that forced the Vikings to retreat and accept a partition of England. The eastern regions became known as the Danelaw territory, ruled largely by Viking law and culture, while Wessex remained the stronghold of Anglo-Saxon leadership. From this fragile recovery, Alfred and his descendants began the long process of reclaiming lost lands. In 927, his grandson Athelstan succeeded in capturing York and, for the first time in history, declared himself King of the English. This marked the early birth of a united England, forged not by natural growth but through survival, struggle, and resilience in the face of near destruction. After England's unification under Athelstan, the kingdom entered a period of relative calm, but the peace was far from permanent. The Vikings, though weakened, had not disappeared, and their leaders watched England's growing strength with unease. In the mid-10th century, new Viking fleets began testing England's defenses, raiding coastal towns and probing for weaknesses. Athelstan's successors Edmund, Eadred, and Edgar worked hard to maintain unity, but political factions inside the kingdom created cracks. Local nobles often acted independently, sometimes even negotiating with Viking warlords for personal gain. When King Athelred came to power in 978, he inherited a realm that appeared strong on the surface but was divided beneath. His critics later called him Athelred the Unready, not because he was unprepared, but because his advisors failed him at crucial moments. Viking forces under powerful leaders like Sweyn Forkbeard intensified their attacks, demanding enormous payments of silver known as Danegeld. These payments only encouraged more invasions. In 1013, the situation collapsed entirely when Sweyn launched a full-scale conquest, forcing Athelred to flee into exile and making Sweyn King of England. Although Sweyn died shortly afterward, his son Nut returned with a disciplined army and established firm control over the kingdom. Surprisingly, Knut proved to be a capable and respected ruler, maintaining peace and integrating both Anglo-Saxon and Danish traditions. Under his leadership, England became part of a larger North Sea empire, stretching across Denmark and Norway. But this unity depended entirely on Knut's personal authority, and after his death in 1035, the empire began to unravel. Rival heirs fought for dominance, weakening the kingdom once again and opening the door for another powerful rival waiting across the Channel, Normandy, whose ambitions would soon shape the future of England in ways no one could have predicted. After the collapse of Knut's North Sea Empire, England entered a period of uncertainty that reshaped its political landscape. The throne passed between rival claimants, each backed by competing factions of nobles who were more interested in preserving their own influence than strengthening the kingdom. When Edward the Confessor finally rose to power in 1042, many in England hoped he would restore stability, but Edward's long exile in Normandy had changed him. He trusted Norman advisors, promoted Norman customs, and filled key positions with men who had grown up across the Channel. This created strong resentment among England's powerful families, particularly the Godwin sons, who believed the country was slipping out of Anglo-Saxon hands. Despite this tension, Edward's reign remained relatively peaceful, but a storm was building behind the scenes as multiple leaders quietly planned for the day the childless king would die. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed Edward had promised him the throne. Meanwhile, Harold Godwin's son, the strongest English noble, believed he alone had the right and ability to rule. To complicate matters further, Harald Hardrada of Norway insisted he inherited Knut's old empire and therefore England belonged to him. By the time Edward died in January 1066, three powerful men stood ready to risk everything for the crown. Harold Godwin's son was crowned king immediately, hoping swift action would prevent foreign invasion, but his rivals had already set their plans in motion. Hardrada gathered a massive Viking force, while William secured papal support and assembled a fleet. England suddenly found itself surrounded by enemies, and Harold would have to defend his throne on two fronts. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic years in medieval history, a year that would end Anglo-Saxon England forever and mark the beginning of a new age. The year 1066 opened with tension thicker than ever as King Harold Godwin's son rushed to secure his fragile throne, fully aware that two powerful challengers were preparing to strike. While William of Normandy built his fleet slowly and carefully, Harald Hardrada of Norway moved first. Hardrada, a legendary warrior who had fought across Europe and ruled Norway with iron discipline, believed England was his rightful inheritance through old agreements tied to Knut's empire. With a formidable army and the support of Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig, Hardrada sailed toward the English coast. Their arrival in northern England shocked local forces, who struggled to unite quickly enough to resist. Town after town fell to the invaders as the Viking army marched inland, gathering supplies and establishing strategic control. Harold Godwin's son, stationed far to the south, received the news just as he was preparing for William's invasion, forcing him into an impossible decision. He could not defend both fronts at the same time, yet leaving the north undefended would allow Hardrada to gain strength. Choosing speed over caution, Harold pushed his men into a forced march covering nearly 300 kilometers in record time, hoping to catch the Vikings before they were fully organized. Exhausted but determined, the English army reached the outskirts of York just as Hardrada's forces settled near Stamford Bridge, unaware of the approaching threat. What followed would become one of the most dramatic military encounters in English history, a sudden clash between two seasoned leaders, one fighting to defend his homeland, the other pursuing a long-claimed right. Neither side could afford defeat, and the outcome would shape the future of England only weeks before the next, even greater challenger arrived from across the Channel. At Stamford Bridge, the calm of the early morning gave no hint of the storm that was about to erupt. Hardrada's Viking warriors were resting, many without armor, believing the English were still days away. But Harold Godwinson's astonishing forced march turned the impossible into reality. As the English army appeared over the rise, the Vikings were caught completely off guard, scrambling to form ranks. Hardrada, towering above most men and famed for his fearlessness, rushed to rally his troops. The first clash erupted with brutal force as English housecarls smashed into the Viking shield wall. The battle swayed back and forth with desperate intensity, the noise of steel echoing across the riverbank. Hardrada, wielding his massive two-handed sword, led charge after charge until an English arrow struck him in the throat, bringing down one of the last great Viking kings. His fall shook the morale of the Norse army, but Tostig took command and attempted to hold the line. Harold offered him a chance to surrender, but Tostig refused, choosing loyalty to his alliance with Hardrada over reconciliation with his own brother. Fighting continued until the remaining Vikings broke, their numbers decimated. Only a small fraction survived, and the fleet that had arrived in hundreds of ships returned to Norway with barely 24. Harold's victory was total, but it came at a terrible cost. His army was exhausted, wounded, and many of his best warriors had fallen. Harold had little time to recover. As celebrations faded, a messenger arrived with news that chilled him. William of Normandy had landed in the south with a massive, disciplined invasion force. The triumph at Stamford Bridge, though glorious, had drained Harold's strength just when he needed it most. Now he faced a second war, one far more dangerous and decisive. Barely days after the exhausting victory at Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwin's son faced the grim reality that England's greatest threat had just arrived. William of Normandy, a ruler known for patience, strategy, and unwavering ambition, had finally crossed the Channel after weeks of waiting for favorable winds. His landing at Pevensey was deliberate and calculated. Instead of rushing inland, William secured strong defensive positions, built temporary fortifications, and began raiding nearby lands to force Harold into action. William understood that Harold's army was weakened and far from ready for another battle, but he also knew Harold would not allow southern England to suffer unchecked. Harold, despite his injuries and loss of men, gathered reinforcements as he marched south. Yet the journey was rushed, and many of his troops were weary survivors of Stamford Bridge. Meanwhile, William's forces, well rested, professionally trained, and supported by cavalry, archers, and infantry, were eager to face an opponent they believed God himself had sanctioned them to defeat, thanks to the papal banner William carried. When Harold reached London, his advisors urged him to wait, regroup, and gather a larger force from the shires. But time was a luxury England no longer had. William continued destroying estates loyal to Harold, worsening political pressure and stirring fear across the region. Determined not to appear weak and unwilling to let William cement his foothold, Harold made the fateful choice to march immediately toward Hastings. His army moved swiftly, but morale was split. Some believed in Harold's leadership, while others felt they were being rushed into a battle they were not ready for. As Harold approached the Norman camp, both leaders understood the stakes clearly. This clash would not simply decide a crown, it would determine the fate of England for generations to come. At dawn on October 14, 1066, the hills near Hastings echoed with the steady beat of war drums as Harold Godwinson's tired army took position along the ridge of Senlac Hill. The English strategy was simple but powerful: form a solid shield wall and force the Normans to fight uphill, where cavalry would lose its advantage. Harold's veterans, though drained from weeks of marching and fighting, locked shields with determination, knowing this was the final stand for their homeland. Below them, William of Normandy arranged his army with calm precision, placing archers in front, infantry in the middle, and his elite cavalry at the rear. William's goal was to break the English shield wall, a formation famous for its strength and discipline, but he understood that brute force alone would not be enough. As the sun rose higher, Norman archers unleashed the first volleys of arrows, though many fell short due to the angle of the hill. Infantry followed, charging upward but crashing against the unyielding English line. Again and again the Normans attacked, yet the shield wall held, pushing them back with roars and axe blows. At one point, a rumor spread that William had been killed, causing panic among his troops, but the Duke removed his helmet and rode forward, shouting that he was alive. This bold act steadied the army and allowed William to prepare a new tactic, something rarely used in European warfare at the time. He ordered his troops to feign retreat, pretending to flee in terror. Portions of the English, believing victory was within reach, chased the retreating Normans down the hill, breaking the disciplined wall Harold relied on. It was a dangerous moment, one that William had planned for carefully, and as the English line began to stretch and fragment, the Normans suddenly turned back to strike. The battle was shifting, and England's fate was entering its most fragile moment. As the English line fractured under the pressure of William's deceptive tactics, the once solid shield wall began to lose its strength. Gaps opened where inexperienced FYRD soldiers had rushed downhill, believing the Normans were truly broken. William seized this moment with remarkable precision. His cavalry swept into the open spaces, cutting off pockets of English fighters and preventing them from regrouping. Harold, standing beneath his banners, the Golden Fighting Man and the ancient dragon standard, watched the deterioration with growing concern. He moved up and down the line, urging his men to hold firmly and reform the wall, but fatigue and heavy losses made every command harder to execute. Meanwhile, William ordered a second wave of feigned retreats, each designed to draw out more English warriors and stretch the defensive line thinner. The battlefield became chaotic, with fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupting on every side. Norman archers, now repositioned to higher ground, began firing in curved trajectories, allowing their arrows to fall behind the English shields. These volleys caused increasing damage, striking men who had once been perfectly protected. Around midday, the battle reached a brutal deadlock, neither side willing to yield, both suffering devastating casualties. Harold's elite housecarls, armed with deadly two-handed axes, stood firm even as the line wavered around them. Their resistance kept the English from collapsing entirely, but the strain was visible. Sensing the critical turning point, William ordered a coordinated assault, archers to soften the center, infantry to press the weakened front, and cavalry to hammer the flanks. As the simultaneous attack crashed forward, the English position grew desperate. The ridge that had offered Harold an advantage was now becoming a trap, and with every passing moment, it seemed less likely that his battered, exhausted force could hold out against the relentless Norman assault. As the long and punishing struggle dragged into the afternoon, the English line, once a proud wall of shields, had become a patchwork of exhausted men fighting in scattered clusters. Harold Godwin's son remained at the heart of the battlefield, surrounded by his last circle of housecarls, their axes rising and falling with desperate determination. Each moment grew more critical as Norman pressure tightened like a noose. William, recognizing that the English center was weakening, ordered one final, concentrated push aimed directly at Harold's position. Norman archers stepped forward and released a decisive volley, their arrows arching high into the sky. In the chaos that followed, one arrow fired among thousands struck Harold near the eye, a moment that would be immortalized in legend and tapestry for centuries. Reeling from the blow, Harold struggled to stand, but the Normans surged toward him in a wave. His loyal housecarls formed a protective ring, fighting with ferocity as they tried to shield their wounded king. Yet the Normans, driven by discipline and the promise of victory, broke through the defenders. Harold fell beneath the assault, and with his death, the spirit of the English army collapsed. The remaining troops, leaderless and terrified, began to retreat down the hill, only to be pursued and cut down by Norman cavalry. By sunset, the field at Senlac Hill was littered with the fallen, and the conqueror stood victorious. William surveyed the battlefield knowing that although the fight was won, the conquest of England had only just begun. He now faced the immense task of securing a kingdom that would resist him at every turn. But October 14, 1066, ended with a single, undeniable truth: the age of Anglo-Saxon rule had fallen, and a new Norman era was rising. In the days following the Battle of Hastings, England descended into a tense and uncertain silence. Though the Normans had won a decisive victory, William quickly realized that capturing a crown on the battlefield was far easier than ruling a nation filled with proud and resentful people. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, shocked by Harold's fall, retreated to fortified towns, trying to decide whether to resist or negotiate. In London, panic and confusion spread as news of the defeat reached the city. Yet instead of collapsing into surrender, the English nobles gathered and hastily proclaimed Edgar Atheling, young, inexperienced, and the last royal bloodline heir, as the new king. William understood that even a symbolic rival threatened his claim. Moving with careful strategy, he avoided a direct assault on London, choosing instead to encircle the city by securing surrounding towns and cutting supply routes. His army burned villages whose lords refused to submit, sending a clear message that resistance would be costly. Gradually, fear and political pressure forced many nobles to abandon Edgar and accept William's authority. By December, London opened its gates, and William entered with a mixture of triumph and caution. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, but even this ceremony nearly erupted into chaos when Norman soldiers outside mistook the cheers of the congregation for signs of rebellion and set nearby buildings ablaze. The moment revealed how fragile William's control truly was. He might have worn the crown, but the heart of England was still defiant. Rebellion simmered in the north, loyalties were uncertain, and every Norman knew that the coming years would test their strength far more than any battle. The conquest was not over, it had only changed its battlefield. William's coronation may have given him the crown, but it did not give him peace. Across England, resentment burned fiercely, especially in the north, where loyalty to the old Anglo-Saxon rulers remained strongest. Many local lords refused to recognize a Norman king, secretly plotting uprisings and seeking allies beyond the borders. William responded with a mix of diplomacy and calculated force. In the early months of 1067, he granted land and titles to those willing to submit, hoping to win their cooperation. But he also built a network of fortified castles, strategic strongholds designed not only for defense but to intimidate the population. These wooden motte-and-bailey structures appeared rapidly across the landscape, symbols of Norman dominance rising above towns that once had no need for such fortifications. Meanwhile, Edgar Atheling fled to Scotland, where King Malcolm III welcomed him as a potential tool against Norman expansion. Encouraged by Scottish support and the anger of northern nobles, rebellion erupted in York. Normans stationed there were overwhelmed, and the uprising sent shockwaves through William's fragile government. Furious yet determined, William marched north with overwhelming force. He retook York, executed rebel leaders, and installed new garrisons, but the resistance did not die. Instead, it grew bolder as Danish forces, claiming ancient Viking ties, sailed to join the English rebels. Their arrival transformed a regional revolt into a national crisis. For the first time since Hastings, William faced the terrifying possibility that he could lose control of the kingdom he had fought so bitterly to win. The stage was set for the most brutal chapter of the Norman Conquest, one that would forever change the history and landscape of northern England. The arrival of the Danish fleet in 1069 marked the moment William's conquest faced its greatest test. Sailing down the eastern coast, the Danes aligned themselves with the northern rebels, turning a local uprising into a full-scale war. Their longships filled the River Humber, and thousands of warriors disembarked to join the English resistance. In York, rebels launched a coordinated assault, burning Norman strongholds and slaughtering garrisons that had been stationed to keep order. For the first time since Hastings, the Normans were forced into retreat, and word of their losses spread rapidly, encouraging new revolts across the countryside. William, understanding the severity of the threat, acted with a level of ruthless precision that shocked even his own followers. He gathered a massive army and marched north with relentless speed, determined to break the rebellion before it could spread any further. The Danes, unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with William's disciplined forces, withdrew their ships and waited offshore, offering symbolic support but avoiding battle. This left the English rebels exposed. William laid siege to the remaining strongholds, crushed pockets of resistance, and executed captured leaders without hesitation. But his anger did not stop at the rebels alone. Believing the northern population had aided the uprising, he launched a campaign of devastation that would be remembered for centuries, the event later known as the Harrying of the North. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered. Winter intensified the suffering, and famine swept the region, killing countless innocent people. While brutal, William believed this scorched earth strategy was necessary to end defiance once and for all. By early 1070, northern England lay silent and broken, its spirit shattered. The rebellion had been crushed, but the scars left behind would linger through generations, shaping how future ages remembered both William's rule and tea. With the north devastated and the rebellion crushed, William stood as the undisputed ruler of England, yet his challenges were far from over. The kingdom he now held was deeply wounded, its people grieving, angry, and fearful of further Norman rule. To stabilize his authority, William turned to rebuilding not only structures, but systems of power that would permanently reshape English society. He replaced nearly every Anglo-Saxon earl with Norman lords loyal to him, creating a new aristocracy that owed its wealth and position entirely to the king. Norman knights were granted vast estates across the land, ensuring pockets of military strength in every region. To secure these new territories, William ordered the construction of more advanced stone fortresses, the most iconic being the Tower of London, a stark symbol of unshakable Norman presence in the heart of the capital. Alongside these changes, William restructured the legal and administrative systems, blending Norman customs with existing English traditions to form a more centralized government. But resistance still simmered quietly. Small pockets of rebels hid in forests and marshlands, waging guerrilla warfare that troubled the Normans for years. One of the most famous of these holdouts was Hereward the Wake, a mysterious figure who launched daring strikes from the Isle of Ely, turning the wetlands into a fortress against Norman troops. Though his rebellion eventually fell, it demonstrated that England's spirit of defiance had not completely died. Meanwhile, William continued facing threats from abroad, particularly from Denmark, which repeatedly planned invasions in support of English rebels. Every year brought new tension, forcing William to balance rebuilding with constant vigilance. By the early 1070s, the Norman grip on England was firm but far from comfortable. William had won the crown, but keeping it demanded relentless effort, unyielding authority, and the willingness to reshape an entire nation to SEC. As the 1070s progressed, William tightened his control over England with an administrative brilliance that matched his military strength. He recognized that to govern effectively, he needed more than castles and loyal knights, he needed complete knowledge of the land he ruled. In 1085, faced with renewed threats from Denmark and fearing another invasion, William ordered one of the most extraordinary projects in medieval history, a comprehensive survey of his entire kingdom. This massive undertaking became known as the Domesday Book. Teams of royal commissioners traveled across every county, questioning villagers, landowners, priests, and reeves about who owned what, how much land was farmed, how many livestock were kept, and even how property had been managed in the days of Edward the Confessor. Nothing was too small to record. To the English, it felt as if judgment itself had arrived, hence the name Doomsday, a reference to the final judgment from which nothing could be hidden. The survey allowed William to control taxation, settle disputes, and prevent nobles from secretly expanding their power. It also revealed just how thoroughly England had transformed since 1066. Norman lords now held the vast majority of land, while Anglo-Saxon nobility had been reduced to a shadow of their former influence. Yet despite these dramatic changes, William's reign brought a measure of stability that the kingdom had lacked for decades. Trade revived, new cathedrals rose, and Norman culture blended with English traditions to create a society unlike either had been before. Still, beneath this new order, tension lingered. William's heavy taxes, strict laws, and uncompromising rule bred quiet resentment among those who had lost everything. As the king aged, his enemies, both at home and abroad, began looking for opportunities to challenge him once again, setting the stage for the final, turbulent years of his rule. Despite the order William had imposed, the final decades of his reign were far from peaceful. Tensions simmered on both sides of the Channel because William ruled not only England but also Normandy, and each territory demanded constant attention. When he spent time in England, Norman nobles in France complained about neglect. When he returned to Normandy, English lords whispered that the king cared more for his homeland overseas than for the kingdom he had conquered. These pressures grew even worse when William's eldest son, Robert Curthose, rebelled against him. Robert believed he deserved more authority and lands, and his frustration eventually erupted into open conflict. Shockingly, many Norman nobles sided with the prince, seeing an opportunity to loosen William's firm grip. The quarrel escalated when Robert defeated his own father in a brief skirmish, wounding William's pride far more than his body. Although they reconciled later, the conflict exposed deep fractures within the royal family and the delicate balance that held William's empire together. At the same time, rivals abroad saw weakness. The French king, Philip I, encouraged unrest among William's enemies, hoping to chip away at Normandy's strength. Even in England, scattered pockets of resistance flared up whenever the king's harsh taxation or strict justice pushed communities to the breaking point. Yet William remained relentless. He moved across his territories with calculated force, crushing rebellions, rewarding loyalists, and tightening royal control wherever cracks appeared. But age was catching up with him. Years of war, travel, and political struggle had worn his body down. By the mid-1080s, William was still feared, still respected, but no longer the invincible conqueror of 1066. The question that began to shadow his reign was simple yet dangerous: what would happen to England and Normandy once he was gone? By the late 1080s, the aging William sensed that his vast Anglo-Norman realm stood on uncertain ground, and every decision he made seemed to echo with the weight of the future. His sons Robert, William Rufus, and Henry were all ambitious, all eager for power, and all unwilling to accept a lesser share of their father's legacy. William struggled to determine how to divide his territories, knowing that England and Normandy were too valuable to be entrusted carelessly, yet also aware that keeping them united under one heir could spark jealousy and civil war among the others. As this dilemma consumed him, relations with the King of France deteriorated yet again. Rumors emerged that Philip I mocked William's failing health, suggesting that the once fearsome conqueror had grown too overweight and weak to wage war. Whether the insult was true or not, it reached William and it enraged him. Determined to prove he was still a force to be reckoned with, William launched a final campaign into French territory, setting fire to towns, fields, and fortifications near the border as a show of dominance. But during one of these raids, while riding through the burning ruins of the town of Mantes, William's horse stumbled, throwing him forward against the saddle. The impact caused severe internal injuries, and the king was carried away in agony, unable to continue the campaign. As he lay bedridden in Rouen, the greatest ruler of his age watched his strength fade day by day. Word spread across Europe that William the Conqueror, the man who had reshaped England forever, was close to death. Nobles, church leaders, and potential rivals all waited anxiously, for they knew that when William finally closed his eyes, the true battle for England in Normandy would begin. As William the Conqueror lay dying in Rouen in the summer of 1087, the atmosphere around his bedside grew heavy with tension, ambition, and quiet desperation. The once mighty warrior, who had crossed the Channel, broken England's armies, crushed rebellions, and built a new ruling order, was now too weak to lift even his own sword. The chamber was filled with the murmurs of monks praying, the rustle of nobles whispering, and the persistent fear that the king's final decisions would determine the fate of two great realms. William's mind remained sharp despite the agony that consumed his body. He knew his empire could not remain united, for the rivalries among his sons were now beyond reconciliation. Robert, the eldest, had long demanded control of Normandy and earned his father's distrust through reckless behavior. William Rufus, bold and calculating, was better suited to govern England but fiercely resented his elder brother. Henry, the youngest, desired land and authority but had neither age nor rank on his side. With death approaching, William declared that Robert would inherit Normandy, honoring tradition despite his doubts, while William Rufus would claim the English throne, hoping his stern leadership would preserve stability. To Henry, he left a large sum of silver, enough to build a future, though not enough to satisfy his ambition. As messengers rushed out to alert Robert and Rufus, the king's breath grew shallow, and his attendants began to withdraw, fearing the chaos that might erupt once his heart stopped beating. On September 9, 1087, William finally exhaled his last, and the conqueror's long shadow fell across Europe. Yet even as his body cooled, a storm of rivalry, betrayal, and political maneuvering began to sweep through both England and Normandy, proving that William's final hour was only the beginning of a new struggle for power. As the news of William the Conqueror's death spread through Normandy, Robert Curthose acted with dramatic urgency, determined to secure his inheritance before anyone could challenge his claim. Though often criticized for his carefree nature, Robert now displayed a sudden sharpness born of fear and ambition. He rode to Rouen with a small but loyal force, presenting himself as the rightful duke, and the Norman barons, eager to preserve tradition and avoid turmoil, accepted him with cautious relief. But even as Robert strengthened his hold on Normandy, reports arrived that his brother, William Rufus, had reached England first. With the support of powerful English nobles, especially the ambitious Archbishop Lanfranc, Rufus seized the royal treasury in Winchester and declared himself king within days of their father's passing. This swift move caught Robert off guard, for he had hoped Normandy's support would naturally translate into influence across the Channel. Meanwhile, Henry, armed only with the silver left by his father, traveled between the two realms, quietly buying land, forging alliances, and studying the weaknesses of both his brothers. He knew that patience could become his greatest weapon. In England, the coronation of William Rufus created both hope and anxiety. Some saw him as a strong ruler ready to defend the kingdom, others feared his fiery temper and ruthless ambition. In the taverns, whispers grew that the unity William the Conqueror had built was crumbling faster than anyone expected. Normandy now stood under a duke who struggled with discipline, England under a king who thirsted for power, and Henry, silent but calculating, watched them both. By winter, rumors of rebellion, disputed oaths, and secret baronial meetings began spreading like wildfire, setting the stage for a dangerous confrontation between the three sons of a dead conqueror. The uneasy balance between William Rufus and Robert Curthose shattered almost immediately as distrust spread across both realms like smoke from a distant fire. In Normandy, many barons who had sworn loyalty to Robert quietly doubted his ability to control his temper or his finances. They remembered his impulsive failures and feared a weak duke would endanger their lands. Meanwhile, in England, nobles who disliked William Rufus's harshness and unpredictable anger began secretly sending messages across the Channel, offering their support to Robert if he would challenge his brother's rule. Henry, watching from the shadows, understood exactly what was happening and carefully avoided choosing sides too early, preferring to let his brothers weaken one another. Before long, open rebellion erupted in England as Norman barons rose against William Rufus, claiming they fought to unite England and Normandy under Robert's leadership. Castles fell, villages were burned, and the new king suddenly realized that the throne he had claimed so quickly now sat upon unstable ground. But William Rufus responded with unexpected skill. He traveled the kingdom relentlessly, offering forgiveness to rebels who surrendered and harsh punishment to those who resisted. He promised the English people lower taxes, better justice, and protection from baronial tyranny, earning the loyalty of many who once feared him. As support for the rebellion crumbled, Robert attempted to cross the Channel to join his allies, but storms and lack of funds delayed him again and again, reinforcing doubts about his leadership. By the end of the campaign, William Rufus had crushed the revolt, strengthened his hold on England, and humiliated Robert without ever facing him directly. Yet the rivalry between the two brothers remained unresolved, and Henry, quietly gathering wealth and opportunity, waited for the perfect moment to strike, knowing that the true battle for their father's legacy had only just begun. In the aftermath of the failed rebellion, the relationship between the three brothers grew more tangled than ever, marked by rivalry, suspicion, and brief moments of uneasy cooperation. Robert Curthose, embarrassed by his inability to aid his supporters, faced growing unrest among the Norman barons, who complained that their duke preferred feasts and hunting to restoring order or defending their borders. William Rufus, now firmly secure on the English throne, saw his brother's weaknesses as an opportunity, and he began quietly funding rebellious Norman nobles to keep Robert distracted and unstable. Yet even as the two older brothers clashed through proxy wars, Henry continued moving like a patient strategist across their territories, investing his silver in key fortresses, winning the respect of local knights, and presenting himself as the only brother capable of true discipline and justice. In 1089, Robert attempted to regain lost prestige by launching a campaign to fortify Normandy and reclaim authority over unruly barons, but his efforts drained his treasury so quickly that he was forced to negotiate with both his brothers for financial aid. William Rufus offered a loan, but only on terms designed to keep Robert dependent, while Henry, sensing opportunity, provided money quietly, expecting influence in return. Their fragile peace soon shattered again when conflict erupted along the Norman and Maine border, threatening to pull all three brothers into another cycle of war. Robert demanded help, Henry insisted on repayment, and William Rufus prepared to intervene only if it strengthened his political advantage. The people of Normandy, exhausted by mismanagement and constant turmoil, began to wonder if any of William the Conqueror's sons could rule with the strength and clarity their father once possessed. And somewhere in this growing storm, destiny prepared to shift, for one brother would soon be forced into a decision that changed the balance of power forever. Tensions between the brothers reached a breaking point when Robert, overwhelmed by pressure from rebellious barons and financial ruin, made a desperate choice that would reshape the future of Normandy. In 1091, he agreed to meet William Rufus in a precarious attempt to negotiate peace, but instead of confronting each other with anger, the two brothers surprised the realm by forging an unexpected alliance. William promised to help Robert restore order in Normandy, defeat their mutual enemies, and secure the duchy's borders on the condition that Robert recognize William as the rightful king and allow him influence over Norman affairs. Robert, cornered by circumstance and lacking the strength to stand alone, accepted the terms, hoping that his brother's military power would stabilize his rule. The brothers then turned their combined attention toward the Scottish threat and the lingering ambitions of Edgar Atheling, who still sought a chance to reclaim the English crown. Henry, however, was outraged by this sudden alliance, for he knew that a united front between Robert and William could crush his growing power. With no allies and limited resources, Henry was forced to retreat to western Normandy, where he fortified himself in the rugged region of Domfront. There, surrounded by enemy forces and short on supplies, Henry held out fiercely, refusing to surrender even as Robert and William marched against him. The siege dragged on for months, and instead of breaking Henry, it won him admiration from local knights who respected his resilience and leadership. Slowly, the people of the region began to shift their loyalty toward the youngest brother, sensing in him the strength and stability missing from Robert and the honesty missing from William. Though Robert and William eventually withdrew, believing Henry trapped and isolated, they had unintentionally helped him build the foundation of his future power, setting the stage for a dramatic reversal neither of them expected. Henry's unexpected rise from a besieged fugitive to a respected regional leader marked the beginning of a turning point in the struggle between the three brothers. While Robert and William believed they had weakened him, Henry was quietly transforming Domfront into the heart of his growing power. The local population admired his discipline, fairness, and willingness to listen, traits neither of his brothers possessed. Knights who once served Robert began defecting to Henry's side, drawn by his reputation as a patient and just commander. Meanwhile, William Rufus and Robert Curthose resumed their uneasy alliance, but cracks quickly formed as each began doubting the other's loyalty. William suspected Robert of making secret deals with rebel barons, while Robert feared William intended to claim Normandy entirely. Their cooperation grew shaky, and the tension created space for Henry to expand his influence. Across Normandy, landowners frustrated by Robert's mismanagement and constant financial demands sent messages to Henry, seeking a leader who could restore stability. Henry, cautious but determined, accepted their support while avoiding open conflict, slowly weaving a network of alliances strong enough to challenge both his brothers. By 1093, Robert's authority had eroded so severely that many Norman nobles preferred Henry's rule, and rumors spread that even some of Robert's closest advisors were considering switching sides. William Rufus, sensing danger, began preparing for a larger conflict, determined not to let Henry gain too much momentum. Yet Henry stayed patient, choosing strategy over aggression. He built loyalty brick by brick, knowing that when the final confrontation came, strength would matter less than the unity he had forged. As winter settled over Normandy, all three sons of the conqueror stood on the edge of an unavoidable conflict, and destiny was quietly shifting toward the brother who had once seemed least likely to rule. By early 1094, the fragile balance between the brothers finally collapsed as Robert Curthose, under pressure from restless barons and short of funds once again, made the fateful decision to reclaim Domfront and crush Henry's growing power before it became unstoppable. Determined to reassert his authority, Robert gathered a sizable force and marched toward Henry's stronghold, confident that his younger brother would surrender once surrounded. But when Robert's army arrived, they found Domfront stronger and better defended than ever. Henry had transformed the once rough frontier fortress into a symbol of his resilience, supported by loyal knights and townspeople who viewed him as their protector. Robert attempted negotiations, demanding Henry's allegiance and control of the region, but Henry refused with a calm certainty that stunned the messengers. For days, Robert's forces probed the defenses, expecting Henry's supporters to falter, yet the opposite occurred. More nobles began joining Henry, slipping through forests and narrow passes to reinforce him. Realizing his position was weakening, Robert called on William Rufus, hoping their alliance would intimidate Henry and force a quick resolution. William, eager to prevent Henry from becoming a threat, sailed to Normandy and confronted his younger brother with an offer: surrender Domfront and accept a lesser lordship, or face a united army. But Henry, now supported by a growing coalition of Norman knights, stood firm. His refusal impressed even his enemies, while William grew increasingly frustrated, seeing that force alone would not break Henry's will. After weeks of stalemate, Robert and William withdrew, unable to defeat Henry without risking a disastrous civil war. In their retreat, they left behind a truth neither wished to admit: Henry had emerged as a leader capable of defying both of them. From that moment onward, the struggle for dominance within the conqueror's legacy would never be the same. The failed siege of Domfront marked a decisive shift in the power struggle, and as Robert and William retreated, Henry stepped into a new phase of leadership, one shaped not by desperation but by strategy. With the region firmly under his control, he began traveling through nearby towns and strongholds, strengthening alliances with nobles who longed for stability after years of misrule. Henry's calm authority, sharp intelligence, and fairness impressed even those who had once dismissed him as the least significant of the conqueror's sons. Meanwhile, Robert returned to Rouen humiliated, facing a duchy that no longer respected him. The nobles whispered openly now, saying that Robert lacked the discipline to rule and that Normandy needed a stronger hand, someone like Henry. William Rufus, watching all this from England, grew increasingly uneasy. He had hoped the siege of Domfront would weaken Henry permanently, but instead it had transformed him into a legitimate contender for greater power. Determined to keep his younger brother in check, William hatched a plan to draw Henry back into his orbit. He invited Henry to England, offering him land, wealth, and political influence, gifts designed to bind him with gratitude. But Henry, wary of William's ambitions, declined politely, choosing instead to remain in Normandy, where his presence mattered most. While the older brothers plotted and argued, Henry continued building trust among the Norman lords by protecting trade routes, resolving disputes, and enforcing justice with a firm but even hand. By the end of the year, many in Normandy quietly believed that Henry, not Robert, should hold the ducal title. And although neither of his brothers realized it, Henry's patient work was laying the foundation for a future in which he would no longer need to bargain for power. He would claim it. The question now was not whether Henry would rise, but how soon destiny would force the confrontation that would make it possible. As the tension between the brothers reached its peak, the balance of power finally began to tilt in Henry's favor in ways even he had not fully expected. William Rufus, ruling England with iron discipline and fierce ambition, had grown increasingly paranoid about threats to his crown. His temper, once merely feared, had now turned unpredictable, and many nobles whispered that the king trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. In the summer of 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, William Rufus was struck by a sudden arrow, killing him instantly. Some claimed it was an accident, others whispered it was an assassination, but whatever the truth, the forest swallowed the secret forever. What mattered was this: Henry was nearby. Seizing the moment with remarkable speed, he rode directly to Winchester, secured the royal treasury, and had himself crowned King of England within days. Robert Curthose, returning from the First Crusade as a celebrated hero, expected the throne to be his by right of seniority, but he found England already united behind Henry, who promised fair laws, restored rights, and stability the people desperately wanted. Robert attempted to challenge his younger brother, crossing the Channel with an invading force, but Henry, far stronger than before, confronted him at Alton, where the two negotiated a fragile peace. Yet the truce fooled no one. Henry knew that as long as Robert ruled Normandy, England could never be secure. And Robert, weakened by debts and division, lacked the strength to stop Henry's growing ambition. As Henry consolidated his rule, reforming laws, and winning the loyalty of the English nation, everyone sensed that a final confrontation between the two surviving sons of the conqueror was inevitable. The question was not whether it would come, but when. The uneasy peace between Henry and Robert could never last, for both brothers knew that England and Normandy would remain unstable as long as two rival heirs shared their father's legacy. Henry, now a confident and calculating king, spent the next few years strengthening his alliances, expanding his treasury, and preparing for the inevitable conflict. Robert, burdened by debts from the Crusade and surrounded by rebellious Norman lords who no longer trusted his leadership, struggled to hold his duchy together. His rule weakened with each passing season, while Henry's influence grew across both coasts of the Channel. When a group of Norman nobles appealed to Henry for protection against Robert's failing governance, Henry found the justification he needed. In 1106, the King of England crossed into Normandy, leading a disciplined army determined to end decades of rivalry. The brothers met at the decisive Battle of Tinchebray, where Robert fought with courage but lacked the unity Henry commanded. The clash was brutal, echoing the long struggle between the sons of the conqueror. But Henry's strategy prevailed. Robert was captured and taken prisoner, ending his ambitions forever. Normandy surrendered soon afterward, reuniting William the Conqueror's realms under a single ruler for the first time since his death. Henry treated his brother with dignity but kept him in honorable captivity for the rest of his life, knowing that mercy without caution could undo everything he had built. With Robert defeated and William Rufus long dead, Henry stood alone as master of England and Normandy, the last son of the conqueror and the only one who fulfilled their father's dream of a united realm. His rise from the overlooked youngest brother to a powerful and respected king became one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history, the true final chapter of the conqueror's legacy.